Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiator. So just a pretty quick video to talk about a little project that I've been having going on the side. It's a very personal thing really, and I don't know if it'll be of much interest to many of you, but here I've got a 1845 pattern infantry officer's sword, British Victorian, mid-Victorian, probably dates about the 1880s actually. And this is a sword that came to me with a bunch of others that I was intending to sell through my company, Eastern Antique Arms. And, you know, swords come to me, sometimes they're in quite a dirty state. I clean them up, I photograph them, stick them on the website and sell them. But some of them I keep. And I started out this business, you know, because I wanted to improve my collection. And, you know, that was the prime motivation. As time's come on, time's passed, as it were, I've made it into one of my sort of incomes, into one of my businesses. Now, this sword, this is seems like a standard infantry officer sword. It is a Wilkinson, which is nice, but there are a few strange things about it. I'll just put the belt and scabbard down for a second. So the first thing that struck me about this when I got it was that it had been very extensively service sharpened and was still sharp. So sharp in fact that I could just take it straight out into the garden and cut water bottles with it with no problem whatsoever. It has a really good edge on it, really good, and it's service sharpened down to there, which is about as far down as you need to service sharpen these sorts of swords, because remember that you're aiming to parry or defend with that portion of the blade. So you really don't need it, you're not going to be cutting anyone down there, so you don't really need any edge down there, and you may as well leave a bit more meat on the edge for defensive purposes. And this was normal in the Victorian period. It wasn't universal, but it was normal. So it's sharpened all the way up there, it's sharpened around the false edge, very pointy. But there were a few things that struck me as odd about it. First of all, it is a Wilkinson, and I know that by the HW in the proof slug. Let's bring it up so you can have a little better look of it there. So this proof slug here, this is something that came in, pioneered by Henry Wilkinson in 1845 and was copied by other manufacturers in Britain thereafter. But some manufacturers, not all of them, but some of them had their own particular style of inscription or wording or kind of a monogram or whatever image in that brass proof disc, and the Wilkinson one was HW, which stands for Henry Wilkinson. You can find, for example, WB for William Buckmaster, or you could find the word proof with a sort of a line with a star in it and a line with a star in it above and below, and that's for Robert Mole of Birmingham. You could find the word proved with a T in the middle, and that would be for Edward Thurkell, and so on. So some of the best and most illustrious British sword makers of the day had their own particular proof slug. So I know that's a Wilkinson. I also know, because it has a serial number on the back, there we go, that corresponds to Wilkinson's numbering system for the 1880s. I think this is 1885 or 6, so around the time of the sort of General Gordon Sudan campaign, the relief campaign, just after that in fact. But there was something else about the blade, so those are kind of typical things. The two things about the blade that struck me as remarkable, apart from the fact that it had been very well service sharpened, were that it is plain, it is without etching. Now, what I mean by that is it's without decoration. If we just grab another sword for a minute, and you probably won't be able to see actually on this light, but if you look on my website, you'll see the standard formula is to have etched decoration down the fuller of the blade. And this doesn't have that, and it's not that it's been polished out, it clearly never had it. And it doesn't have the maker's name on the other side as well, so it's what seems to be a deliberately plain blade. So that's unusual, but it is something you often find associated with so-called fighting swords, so swords that seem to have been ordered as weapons rather than just as dress items. And finally, it's especially long, which is nice. So the standard length of an infantry officer's sword at the time in Britain is 32.5 inches. Remember, they use imperial, of course. You can convert that into centimetres yourself. So 32.5 inches is standard. They actually vary between 32 and 33. It's not uncommon to find 33.25 as well. Once you get above that, that's far more unusual. This is actually a 35-inch blade. Now, 35 inches is typical actually for a cavalry length blade. That being said, whilst it does feel a bit longer and does feel a little bit more hefty, it doesn't feel unwieldy, and it does feel lighter than a cavalry sword. It's still the infantry standard width of 1 inch and 1/8. Yes, that's right, 1 inch and 1/8. It's a lovely sword. It's a solidly made, good condition sword. There were some there were some mechanical issues with the hilt when it came to me. The hilt was loose. So I decided, I like this sword so much, I'm actually going to use this for solo training. I might even use it for some cutting. In fact, I have done. So I wanted to tighten the hilt up, so I did it in the traditional way. I'm not going to go into how I did that right now. I probably should have filmed the whole thing because it's quite interesting, especially with Wilkinsons. Wilkinsons, incidentally, have a double nut system. They have an internal nut and an external nut. I'll go into that another time. But anyway, I fully tightened the hilt, and now hopefully you can hear that, it rings like a bell. If the hilt's at all loose, it won't ring. So it's all solid, all tight, ready to fight with, super sharp. And it came in its scabbard. It didn't come with this belt, incidentally. This was a Sam Browne belt set that I already had that this scabbard fits into, but it did come with a scabbard. It's a wood-lined, leather-covered scabbard with a steel chape at the end. So could be Indian service, could be colonial service, not really sure. But the main thing I want to point to is that the hilt is more or less standard. It is of the straight gripped type rather than the canted grip type. I actually prefer the canted grip type, but the straight grip has its virtues as well. And it is a regulation hilt. Now, despite the fact that the blade is great, and these, as I've spoken about previously, these 1845 pattern blades, although they're not terribly broad, or they're not terribly heavy, they're not terribly curved, they do cut really, really well. They're a very good compromise design blade, and really functionally they're very similar to backsword blades of the 18th century, for example. And in cutting, I own all sorts of different swords, from arming swords, long swords, katanas, sabres, more and less curved sabres, falchions, all sorts of things. So I cut with lots of different sorts of swords, and quite honestly, certainly against light to medium targets, these blades perform as well as any of them. Okay, so don't think that because they're fairly slender that they're necessarily less potent cutters. You can easily chop through someone's forearm, or open up their head or whatever with one of these blades. Easy. Okay, so very functional blade. But one of the drawbacks of this design of sword, I have to concede, despite the fact that you all know I love these types of swords, and I particularly love the 1845 pattern, one of the drawbacks is the brass hilt. And Henry Wilkinson's company, which was taken over, or at least it was managed by John Latham by the late 1850s, but certainly by the early 1860s. John Latham was running the company. Henry Wilkinson had died, and John Latham took over the company. He was his son-in-law, I believe, and he gave lectures on the design of swords, and he fully concedes this is a faulty design. There are a number of problems with the design of this guard. Okay, number one, it's made of brass, and whilst the French thought that brass guards were perfectly sufficient, the British overall, despite the fact that they did use brass for this model of sword, didn't really like brass guards. If you could afford your perfect sword kind of thing, you'd get a steel guard, and in fact you do get versions of this sword where the guard is made of steel and then it's gilded so it looks the same, but it's actually made of steel instead of brass. The problem with brass, of course, is it's softer, bends more easily, and can be cut through, as we would say. So it can be smashed in or literally cut through, perhaps by a very powerful stroke from an axe or something like that. Additionally, it doesn't provide fully symmetrical coverage. It is asymmetrical. Well, that's not so much of a problem because it does have a fair amount of weight still on this side, but asymmetrical guards can lead to twisting in the hand, but they are asymmetrical because, of course, when you're holding a sword, if you're right-handed, more of your hand projects on the right-hand side than on the left-hand side. So they protect enough, and they are also more comfortable to wear because when it's against your side, against your left-hand side, you don't have so much sticking out on that side. The third issue with these guards, the so-called Gothic hilt as they're known, is that they do have openings in here. Now this is what I want to talk about here. So how can you make this sword, if this was a sword, and I now view this sword as kind of like my service sword, this is the sword I will train with, this is the sword I will cut with, and I'm thinking about, well, it's got a brass guard, let's say that, you know, if you were serving in the 1880s and you had been given or bought a sword before you knew better with a brass guard, too late to order a steel guard. So how can you make this better? Well, there is one way that they did make these guards slightly better, and it was actually very, very common, but doesn't get spoken about and doesn't get featured an awful lot. And here I have an original antique example which has the remnants of it in place. So you will notice that where the holes are in the design of guard, and you can see it's the same design of guard, it is filled with leather. Now this leather is, I say remnants, it is not very secure and it's not even complete. But you can see that originally they're attached in two ways. Number one, the leather is actually glued on the inside surface of the guard. And number two, they're actually bound at the bottom and at the top. Not all of them are, some of them are just glued. And in fact, this one doesn't have it, but some of them, and I think, ironically, no, this one doesn't have it, but some of them do have tiny little holes here and here, 2 holes down here and 2 little holes up here. And that is for putting a wire or a thread through to mechanically connect, as well as the glue, the leather to the inside of the guard. And what does that achieve? Well, achieves a couple of things actually. Number one, of course, what we're talking about here is protection of the hand in combat. But it also, so it prevents weapons going through the hole, at least to some degree. It prevents them as easily passing through the hole and hitting your hand on the underneath. Indeed, you could pierce the leather. Leather is not indestructible, of course. But it does nevertheless impede the kind of the easiest, the lightest of the things going through those gaps. But secondly, there is the more practical thing as well as in combat, that we know these hilts got very hot in hot countries, and that metal gets extremely, like, too hot to touch basically. So we know that on service they often wrapped the grips with twine or leather or other things to make them a bit more grippy. But if you've got a leather cover on the inside of the guard, then it helps protect you from the heat of the guard. But we're talking about combat in this particular video, and it does add a bit of thickness to the guard and provides a bit of extra filling of the holes in those gaps. Now, there was a chap called Fred Burnaby, who, those of you who like Victorian military history will know exactly who Fred Burnaby is. He died during the Sudan Wars in combat, stabbed in the throat with a spear and taken down by dervishes whilst trying to take them on with his sword. He was famous for earlier going to war with a shotgun and shooting lots of people with a shotgun, a double-barreled shotgun incidentally. And his sword actually survives in the Horse Guards Museum in Westminster, in the middle of London. And he has a liner on his sword. Now, in the Horse Guards, it was quite normal to have a white buff leather liner. Now, buff leather is quite tough stuff. So if you're going to make a liner that you want to have a physically protective, practical purpose to it, make it of buff leather rather than normal patent leather. Okay, that's the first tip. But instead of the normal buff leather liner in white, he has actually got a steel liner. So it's just a sheet of steel. So instead of this sheet of leather, it is literally a sheet of steel inside the normal guard, so it fills all the holes without much weight really. So you've got the strength of the thick bars here, and you might say, why do you have these holes at all? Well, if you made the whole guard of solid metal without these holes in, you'd end up with an overweight hilt basically, so it'd muck up the qualities of the sword. So you put these holes into the sword, handles nicely and is lighter. So he had a liner put in of sheet steel that was then painted white, so it looks like the buff leather liners, but provides the protection of a sheet of steel underneath the actual main guard as well. So you've got the impact protection of the thick bars. In his case, it was a steel guard as well, rather than a brass guard. But you've got the protection of the thick bars, and you've got the thrust protection of, against spears or swords or anything else, or bayonets coming through those holes, because you've got the sheet steel underneath. So I am considering experimenting a bit with liners on my service sword. This is my service sword. Viewing it as my service sword is I'm completely happy with the blade, with the fighting qualities of this blade and the scabbard and everything else, but the guard and the grip's perfectly good. The guard leaves something to be desired. It is not the ideal guard that I would choose, but assuming that my option is to not just buy a new sword or get a new guard fitted, how would I optimize this without physically changing it? We do sometimes know that they had a bar of steel riveted in here on the knuckle bow, but without physically doing things that will mess up the antique, so removable and reversible things. First thing I'm going to have a go at doing is making a leather liner, a traditional typical type of leather liner. I also want to make a buff leather liner because they look really cool and it's even more protective than normal leather. And I might have a go at making a removable steel liner like Fred Burnaby's sword had. Anyway, I hope there's a few things of interest in this video. You now know what my preferred cutting sword looks like because it's this one. I don't think I've shown it on video so far, but I've been working on it, I've been cleaning it up. I've been putting it back into service, and as I mentioned, when this came to me, the hilt was in quite a state, and I've brought it back, lovingly brought it back to where it should be. So I certainly don't feel that I have desecrated an antique. I feel I brought an antique back from the rim of being ignored for the rest of its existence. Anyway, thanks for watching. Give us a like and a subscribe if you haven't done already, and I'll see you soon for another video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.